Matthew 23, When the Lamb Roars. Arthur Vance adjusted his glasses and looked around his living room. On the small easel, nestled between his bookshelves, a pristine white dry erase board sat waiting, a black marker resting in its tray. "All right, folks," Arthur said, his voice carrying the warm, measured cadence of his 30 years teaching history. Tonight we're diving into Matthew chapter 23. Before we open the text, let's just address the elephant in the room. This chapter is famous for being tough. It's loud, it's intense, and it catches people off guard. Chloe Bennett, sitting cross-legged on the sofa next to her husband, looked down at her open Bible and sighed softly. "Can I just say it first? It makes me really uncomfortable. I read this, and it just feels mean. I've always loved the verses about Jesus being meek and mild, carrying the lost sheep, or telling the weary to come to him. Here he sounds furious. It feels completely out of character." Across the room, Gavin Cross leaned back, a faint smirk on his face. "Honestly, Chloe, that's exactly why I like it. There's so much fake, performative stuff out there today. Seeing Jesus completely dismantle religious phonies who think they're better than everyone else, it's refreshing. He's taking the gloves off. I get both sides," Elena Rostova chimed in, adjusting a throw pillow in her armchair. "But it still feels jarring. It's like a switch flipped compared to the chapters right before this." Ethan Bennett looked back and forth between his wife and Gavin, rubbing the back of his neck. He cleared his throat, a bit sheepish. "Look, I'm the new guy here, and I'm still trying to piece the whole timeline together. Before we debate whether he's being too harsh, can someone tell me who he's actually yelling at? Scribes? Pharisees? I know they're the bad guys in the Gospels, but who were they really? Why is he so mad at them specifically?" Arthur smiled, stepping up to the dry erase board. He pulled the cap off his marker with a satisfying pop. "That is exactly where we have to start, Ethan," Arthur said, drawing a rough timeline on the board. "First, let's look at the geography and the timing. We are in Jerusalem, inside the temple courts. It is Passion Week. Just a few days ago, Jesus rode into the city on a donkey. Since then, the establishment has been sending their best debaters to trap him in a legal loophole so they can arrest him. He's been inspected, tested, and questioned, and now he turns the tables." Arthur wrote 2 words on the board: scribes and Pharisees. To answer your question, Ethan, the scribes were the legal technicians. They were the constitutional lawyers of the Mosaic Law. If you wanted to know the exact microscopic legal definition of a Sabbath rule, you went to a scribe. The Pharisees were a massive, hyper-pious lay movement. They weren't corrupt politicians in the secular sense. They were the spiritual elite. The common people looked up to them as the holiest men in Israel. Elena frowned, processing this. So, they weren't obvious criminals or outcasts? To the average guy in the crowd, these were the saints? Exactly, Arthur nodded, which is precisely why Jesus is speaking this way. He isn't throwing a temper tantrum. He is issuing a public safety warning to the crowds. He's telling them they sit in Moses' seat. When they read the actual text of Scripture, listen to it, but do not do what they do. He is breaking the psychological and spiritual chokehold this corrupt institution had on everyday people. Thomas Sterling, who had been quietly tracking the conversation with his finger on his Bible, looked up. Beside him, his wife Martha was already flipping back into the Old Testament. "It goes even deeper than a warning, Arthur," Thomas said, his voice deep and seasoned. "Think about the Passover tradition. The lamb had to be inspected for 4 days by the priests to ensure it had no blemish. They inspected Jesus for days, trying to find a flaw, and found none. But the divine irony is that while they thought they were inspecting him, the Lamb was actually inspecting them. Matthew 23 is the reading of the inspection report, and the verdict is total bankruptcy. And Jesus isn't inventing a new tone here," Martha Sterling added, her eyes lighting up as she found her page. "He is speaking the exact language of the Old Testament prophets. Chloe, honey, look at what God says through Ezekiel. Let's look at the case law Jesus is pulling from." Martha cleared her throat and read from Ezekiel chapter 34. "Ah, shepherds of Israel, who have been feeding yourselves. Should not shepherds feed the sheep? The weak you have not strengthened, the sick you have not healed, the injured you have not bound up, but with force and harshness you have ruled them. Now look at Matthew 23, verse 4, Martha continued softly, looking across at Chloe. Jesus says the Pharisees tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to move them with their finger. It's the exact same crime. They were spiritual bullies, making God's truth a crushing weight instead of a refuge. Elena gasped slightly. the pieces snapping together. Oh, wow. And look at Ezekiel chapter 8. God literally takes Ezekiel on a tour of the temple, punches a hole in the wall, and shows him all the secret, detestable idols the elders are worshiping in the dark while acting holy on the outside. Exactly, Arthur said, drawing a circle around his notes on the board. So when Jesus calls them whitewashed tombs, beautiful on the outside, but full of dead men's bones inside, he is doing exactly what God did in Ezekiel 8. He's punching a hole in their polished, legalistic wall and showing the crowd the rot hidden underneath. This isn't a mean Jesus breaking character. This is Yahweh returning to his own temple, fulfilling Ezekiel 34, firing the bad shepherds and protecting his battered flock. The living room went quiet. Gavin, who had been enjoying the imagery of a confrontational Jesus, looked down at his Bible, the smugness fading from his expression. "It's not just anger, is it?" Gavin muttered, his finger tracing the text. "Look at how the chapter ends." Arthur sat down, replacing the cap onto his marker with a gentle click. "Read it for us, Gavin." Gavin read slowly, the weight of the words setting in. "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often would I have gathered your children together, as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing? See, your house is left to you desolate." "The woes don't end in a shout of triumph," Arthur said quietly. "They end in tears." The Greek word for woe isn't just a curse, it's a funeral dirge. It's a cry of profound, heartbroken lament. Jesus is looking at a people who have been so thoroughly brainwashed and scattered by their leaders that they are rejecting the very God who came to rescue them. Chloe looked down at her Bible, her eyes glistening. The discomfort she had felt at the beginning of the evening hadn't vanished, but it had transformed. "He's still the good shepherd," Chloe whispered, looking up at Arthur. The harshness, it wasn't malice, it was the fierce protection of a father defending his kids from wolves. He was trying to tear down the walls keeping them from him, even if it broke his heart to do it. And the tragedy, Thomas added softly, closing his Bible, is that they chose the walls. Arthur nodded, letting the weight of the chapter rest over the room. Your house is left to you desolate. God was leaving the building, preparing for the cross. Let's take a few minutes to pray and ask ourselves where we might be building walls of our own.